Documented 187 is a true crime podcast. Today's episode discusses sensitive topics, including elder abuse, violence, and death. Please see the show notes for more details and disclaimers. Listener discretion is advised. You sit at a scarred wooden table in the kitchen where the air refuses to move. Even with the window crack open to the humid Sacramento afternoon, the neighborhood outside continues on without you. Someone mowing a lawn too close to dinner, a screen door slamming 2 houses down, a radio playing low through another open window. But none of it reaches you in any meaningful way. The linoleum beneath your feet has dulled to a tired gray. It no longer reflects light. Scuff marks arc across the floor in uneven patterns, layered atop one another like a timeline. Heavy boots, work shoes, the grit of garden soil pressed in by residents coming and going. The stench of boiled meat sits heavy in the air, mixed with the sharp synthetic sweetness of cheap perfume. It settles at the back of your throat, coats your tongue, makes every breath feel deliberate. A woman moves through the kitchen with a practiced rhythm, not rushed or hesitant. Her floral housecoat brushes against the plywood cabinets as she turns. She sets a porcelain cup in front of you, floral, delicate. Her hand is steady. Her smile is patient, but it is not inviting. You lift the cup because that is what you are expected to do. Refusal will require energy you don't want to spend. The tea is too sweet, aggressively so, but beneath the sugar, there is something metallic, bitter. It clings to your tongue long after you swallow. You tell yourself it is a cheap brand, old leaves, maybe a dirty kettle. She talks about the weather, local elections, and nothing at all. Her voice is even, pleasant, careful not to rush you. You try to follow the conversation, but the words drift in and out, dissolving into the ticking of the clock on the wall. Each second lands with exaggerated weight. Your vision begins to fray at the edges. The yellow wallpaper bleeds into itself like wet watercolors. Green becomes pink. Pink becomes movement. The room pulses slowly, in time with your heart, which feels too loud inside your chest. You try to stand. You tell your legs to push the chair back. They do not respond. Your arms feel heavier than they should, as if gravity has increased without warning. The table presses into your ribs as you slump forward, and for a moment, you wonder if you are imagining this, if this will pass. It doesn't. Your gaze drifts to the backyard. The garden looks uneven. One square of dirt sits higher than the rest. The soil darker, freshly turned. Sunlight catches the edges of the silt near the fence, highlighting disturbances that were not there before. The woman sits across from you now. Her hands are folded neatly on the table. She watches your face with an attention that feels clinical. She does not ask if you are all right. She doesn't reach out. She waits. The light in the room dims because your body is shutting doors one by one. The neighborhood sounds fade. The ticking clock stretches, distorts. The Victorian walls feel farther away, as if the room is expanding while you are shrinking inside it. She remains still. She has learned that interference complicates things. The first shovel breaks the surface of the backyard just as the morning fog begins to lift. The soil is dry and compacted, resisting the blade before finally giving way with a dull scrape that carries farther than expected down F Street. Yellow tape is raised along the fence line without urgency. The full scope of what they were standing over had not revealed itself. Neighbors gather anyway. Some stand on concrete steps. Others lean against parked cars, coffee cooling in their hands. Their voices remain low because watching a familiar yard being dug apart feels intrusive, like witnessing something that should not be observed too closely. The yard itself looks unremarkable, small, narrow, bordered tightly by neighboring fences. It does not appear capable of holding much. Then a smell arrives abruptly. It settles into the air with a sweetness that feels wrong, clinging to clothing and skin. The excavation takes on a different tone. No one speaks yet, but the pace of the work changes. When the first remains come into view, the digging stops. The pause is immediate and collective. One shovel remains embedded in the soil, its handle tilted forward where it has been released. Another officer steps back without instruction, creating space that suddenly feels necessary. A radio crackles briefly, with a request for confirmation that does not truly require it. The woman who rents the rooms stands nearby and watches. Her posture is composed. Her expression suggests concern. She does not pace or interfere. She waits. Then she asks how long this is going to take. The following day, the excavation resumes. As dirt is cleared farther along the fence line, another disturbance begins to take shape beneath the surface. The landlady steps out onto the porch and calls the lead detective into the house. She is wearing a coat and holding her purse. She asks if she can have a cup of coffee nearby where her nephew was said to be. He nods and walks her past the crowd to the sidewalk, watching her turn the corner with the respect one shows a beloved grandmother. Then he turns back to the yard and the digging continues. Minutes pass, then an hour. The detective checks his watch, then glances down the street. The sidewalk remains empty. A quick check of the Clarion Hotel lobby confirms what the silence has already said. No coffee. No landlady. Jury. We want to see the elderly people in our communities as an extension of our friends and family. A lot of us are taught to trust our elders because they are supposed to be a source of wisdom. But some of them are a source of crime. Criminals age too. That is how they get us. The search team moved through a house that felt disturbingly normal. The narrow downstairs hallway funneled everyone toward the back, passing a series of doors that stood close together. A chill settled in the kitchen, a stark room built more for function than comfort. The parlor offered a different kind of coldness. A small desk sat against the wall, stacked with administrative debris, benefit checks, mail, records tied to the tenants' money and identities. Papers that should have belonged to the people whose names were printed on them. Instead, they sat organized and waiting. The wooden staircase at the back dropped down into the cellar, where the air grew heavy and damp. Finished floors gave way to packed dirt, creating a dark space hidden beneath the orderly floorboards above. Upstairs, the layout reportedly repeated itself. More rooms, beds, and evidence of people living tightly packed lives under a woman who controlled nearly everything. Dorothea Puente didn't end up at 1426 F Street by chance. By the time she opened the boarding house, she'd already spent decades figuring out how institutions worked, what they rewarded, overlooked, and how long it took them to realize something had gone wrong. Born Dorothea Gray in 1929, she came into a world marked by instability. Alcoholism and poverty shaped her early years in Southern California, and by the age of 10, both of her parents had died. She moved between relatives' homes and state institutions, learning early on that getting by often meant becoming whoever the person in charge wanted her to be. She tried to find stability through marriage at 16, but being a wife and mother demanded permanence she couldn't maintain. Within 2 years, she had given up custody of her 2 daughters and moved on, forming intense relationships and then walking away when responsibility came with them became a recurring part of her adult life. Early arrests in the 1950s and 60s were mostly about financial scams. By the late 1970s, she was running boarding houses, and her crimes started moving beyond fraud into something much darker. In early 1982, Dorothea drugged a 74-year-old man named Malcolm McKenzie, stole his jewelry, and cleaned out his pockets. But this time, one thing went wrong. He survived. McKenzie woke up. He went to the police, and because he could tell his story, Dorothea ended up in prison. In April 1982, her friend and business partner Ruth Monroe died from a massive overdose of codeine and Tylenol while living with Dorothea. Dorothea told police Ruth had been depressed, and at the time, her death was ruled an overdose rather than investigated as a homicide. When she got out in 1985, she was still under restrictions tied to her earlier fraud and theft convictions, including rules meant to keep her away from the same kind of setup she had taken advantage of before. She ignored them. She went back to Sacramento, moved to F Street, and kept fine-tuning the system she'd been building for 40 years. She knew how to collect the money and how to keep up appearances. And after Malcolm McKenzie survived and reported what happened to him, maybe she had learned something dangerous. Living victims could expose her. Jury, I keep going back to the innocent elderly landlady facade. Dorothea had a paper trail of fraud, drugging, theft, and prison, but she was still able to fall neatly back into the same environment she had already exploited. I wonder what protocols existed for someone like her once she re-entered society. The garden at 1426 F Street was more than a plot of land. It became the site where Dorothea Puente concealed victims whom society had too often learned to overlook. Many of her tenants were elderly, disabled, unhoused, socially isolated, struggling with addiction, living with mental illness, or relying on government assistance. These circumstances made them vulnerable in multiple ways. They needed support and many lacked consistent advocates checking on their well-being. By the time investigators began excavating the yard, it held the remains of lives that, on paper, had been reduced to rent payments, benefit checks, and explanations that failed to prompt sufficient scrutiny. The most significant disruption to that pattern came through Bert Montoya. Bert was vulnerable, but he was not forgotten. He had a social worker, Judy Moyes, who refused to accept the explanation from Dorothea that he had simply relocated to Mexico. Her persistence changed everything. Jury. Dorothea did not require every victim to be entirely alone. She only needed the people around them to be overextended, exhausted, under-resourced, or willing to accept the first explanation she provided that seemed plausible. Judy, however, had time for the shenanigans. She kept asking questions, reviewing the records, and insisting that something was not right. Dorothea left the house with a calm, unhurried stride. That seemingly ordinary departure from the porch gave her a head start that the Sacramento Police Department would spend days trying to overcome. Her movements were not a direct flight out of the city. Accounts placed her first at the Clarion before she moved through bars and transit routes on her way to Los Angeles. She eventually checked into the Royal Viking Motel under an alias and resumed a pattern that had become all too familiar. Dorothea did not retreat completely into hiding. She visited a bar, ordered a drink, and struck up a conversation with Charles Wilgus, a retired pensioner looking for companionship. She told him a story about lost luggage and loneliness. Before long, the conversation shifted from casual small talk to discussions that sounded more like recruitment. Charles returned home and turned on the television. The face of the soft-spoken woman he had met at the bar appeared in the news. The woman wanted in connection with the bodies discovered on F Street was his new acquaintance, Donna Johansson. Wilgus contacted the television station to confirm what he was seeing. The reporter, in turn, notified the Los Angeles Police Department. When officers arrived at the Royal Viking Motel, Dorothea surrendered with the same unsettling composure she had displayed on her own front porch. Wearing a red coat, she quietly took her place in the back of the squad car. The trial of Dorothea Puente began in February 1993, but not in Sacramento. Because of the intense publicity surrounding the death house headlines, the proceedings were moved to Monterey County to ensure a more impartial jury. Prosecutor John O'Mara opened the case by stripping away the image of the kindly grandmother and presenting a very different picture. The prosecution's case relied heavily on financial records. Tenants would disappear, yet their signatures continued appearing on checks. Bank tellers described Dorothea as polite and friendly, often explaining that she was simply helping elderly or disabled friends manage their finances. But according to the state, those friends were already dead, while the money kept flowing. Forensic evidence added another layer to the case. Toxicology testing found traces of a sedative that Puente regularly obtained through prescriptions in the remains recovered from the backyard. Prosecutors argued that the drug supported their theory that she used medication to incapacitate or kill her victims while continuing to collect their benefits. The defense team took a very specific approach. They did not dispute that Dorothea had stolen from her tenants, nor did they deny the bodies had been buried on the property. Instead, they argued that the victims had died from natural causes, illness, addiction, suicide, or old age, and that Dorothea buried them because she feared authorities would discover she was operating a boarding house in violation of her parole. In other words, they asked the jury to view her as a thief who concealed deaths, not as a murderer. And for a time, that strategy appeared to gain traction. After months of testimony and weeks of deliberation, jurors struggled with several of the charges. The advanced decomposition of many of the bodies made it difficult to determine clear causes of death, creating reasonable doubt in some cases. Ultimately, the jury deadlocked on 6 of the 9 murder counts, including the death of Bert Montoya. But they reached verdicts in 3 cases. Dorothea Puente was convicted of first-degree murder in the deaths of Dorothy Miller and Benjamin Fink, and second-degree murder in the death of Leona Carpenter. Those convictions were enough to ensure she would never return to society. After jurors were unable to agree on the death penalty, Dorothea Puente was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jury. The defense strategy was disturbing, but it was built on a clear logical calculation. They admitted the fraud. They admitted the burials. What they challenged was the murder itself. Essentially, they asked you to believe that Dorothea was willing to steal from the dead, but not responsible for causing those deaths. That is a very narrow argument, but the condition of the remains gave the defense room to make it. In several cases, decomposition makes it difficult to establish a definitive cause of death, and that is what makes the verdict so unsettling. The jury found enough evidence to convict her in 3 deaths, but not enough to fully answer what happened to everyone connected to that house. Dorothea understood something ugly about society. She knew certain people could disappear without creating immediate alarm. Thanks to Judy Moyes, some of those people finally had a voice. Ruth Monroe, Everson Gilmoth, Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, Leona Carpenter, Bert Montoya, Betty Palmer, James Gallup, Vera Faye Martin. These were people who should have been protected long before the soil behind that house ever started moving. Dorothea told police she was a good person. But a good person does not drug people, take their money, hide bodies, and keep moving through the world as if nothing happened. Cases like this make me want to side-eye everybody, but that is no way to live. Join us next time for another installment of Documented 187, where a night in a quiet DC townhouse left behind more questions than answers. Until then, slide into the shadows.